actor who would love to be cast in a Marvel movie, or maybe something like Star Wars or Star Trek, or maybe something like Bridgerton, then you are in the right place, because we are going to talk about heightened text and other types of heightened acting, and why it's really, really helpful to learn about this stuff and practice it and get good at it if you want to be a versatile, highly castable actor, which is probably you, right? Because it's most of us. So just before we jump in, I am Sarah Guillot. This is Shakespeare with Sarah. And what does this have to do with Shakespeare? Well, Shakespeare is, of course, a heightened text. It is one of the most well-known heightened texts. And when I'm talking about a heightened text, we're talking about a particular type of writing that contains elements beyond the everyday. Now, that could actually be a few things. Now, with Shakespeare, mostly we think about the poetry, right? It has a poetic nature to it. There's a lot of figurative language and rhetorical devices and all that. That is, of course, part of the heightened text. But it's useful to think about heightened material in a couple of different ways. Firstly, that heightened text could also contain archaic language. Now, that is for sure. Shakespeare's got definitely some archaic language, but that also applies to things like period drama. You know, if you're doing something like Bridgerton, or, you know, if you're watching this in the future, whatever the equivalent of Bridgerton is now, this video is not going to age well, it's fine. Anything like that, any kind of period drama stuff has archaic language in it, which can heighten it. And you can also have things like technical language that can make it become a little heightened. So things like sci-fi and fantasy, where it's a little bit outside the everyday. So heightened is really any type of writing style that falls outside your general naturalism, right? You're not really talking like an everyday person. There's other stuff going on, but it could actually be a couple of different things going on. So the reason we talk about that is because it can apply to a lot of different types of acting. So this is why practicing Shakespeare is actually really handy, because this is going to apply in many of your auditions, maybe more than you think. And actually, there's more to heightened than just the text. It's worth talking about this as well. So there are actually, in my opinion, 3 different kind of categories of heightened. One of them is that heightened text that we just talked about that could have poetry or archaic language or technical language or dragons, you know, all that kind of thing. Then there's also heightened circumstances and heightened style, right? And let me talk about those. So with heightened circumstance, it's really when you've got those kind of things going on that are really not your everyday sort of occasions. So yes, with Shakespeare, you've got things like the god Jupiter descends on an eagle. That is very heightened, right? But also you have things like, I just married this guy and then he's killed my cousin, right? Those kinds of things. Also very common in something like Greek theatre, but also common in things like Game of Thrones or any kind of horror movie. That is very heightened circumstances, right? That's not your everyday sort of stuff, thankfully. Right? So there's actually a lot of different types of heightened circumstance material that can pop up even in TV and film. Now let's talk about heightened style. Heightened style is when you've got that extra level of energy in the body. Maybe it feels a little over the top because it's a little big, but it doesn't necessarily have to have language that's different from the everyday. It could sound everyday, but the style is a little bigger. Yes, the first thing you might think of is actually comedy, because immediately I start doing this. It's kind of bigger, it's kind of comedic. So anything like, just simple examples, even things like Schitt's Creek or 30 Rock, and definitely stuff like Girls 5 Eva or Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt that's just a little cuckoo. That's really big, right? There's big faces, big movement. And that can be really, really common as well. But that heightened style can also apply to things like Marvel movies and action movies that are really big energy. And again, horror, because it's quite big, you need to bring that energy. So Shakespeare feels very heightened because it crosses all three, right? It has that heightened language, it's archaic, and there's poetry. It has heightened energy, that performance style, and it has heightened circumstances. And Greek theater is like that as well, but I think times 100, my opinion. But you can have combos of all of those, right? So something like fantasy, Game of Thrones, kind of House of Dragons, or whatever it's called now. Sorry, I'm not watching that. I gave up on it. It's going to have that heightened circumstances of dragons, but also some archaic language, and maybe sometimes that heightened performance style as well. So I challenge you to think about any, particularly a TV show that you've been watching lately, anything that doesn't just sit that real kind of everyday stuff. I want you to think about whether it enters into any of those heightened categories, or maybe it's a combination of it. And this reflective stuff makes us better actors and more versatile because we understand tone. So in TV and generally in screen work, we refer to it as tone. So if you've ever been told like you need to get to know the world of the show or the tone of it so you can audition, for example, that's what we're talking about here, is actually the sort of style, like how heightened is it? How naturalistic is it? So you can pitch your performance appropriately. A lot of actors actually really are bad at that. They, particularly beginner actors, they approach everything the same way. They're like, I'm going for believable, right? That's number one, believable, grounded, truthful, realistic. And they have that one way of doing everything. But actually, there's a huge amount out there of stuff that is not sitting in that really naturalistic bucket. And actually, let me be more clear than that. It's not really a bucket, it's not, I used to think of it as two buckets. I used to think of it as like the naturalism bucket where everything is realistic and everyday, and then the heightened bucket where everything's a little bit weird and maybe a bit over the top. But it's actually not. It's not buckets, not anymore. Maybe like 20 years ago it was, but now it's not. Now it's a spectrum. So I want you to think about this spectrum from this really naturalistic, everyday kind of material where you watch it and you just feel like you're a fly on the wall. And it's maybe even a bit mumbly, but it just feels like you're just hanging out and almost voyeuristic, just watching what's going on. For me, The Bear is a good example of that, where it's very naturalistic. It almost feels like it's improvised. Maybe some of it is, I don't know. But there's lots of stuff like that where it will fall into that extreme naturalism where it's everyday. Now, that's not everything, right? Because then you get the next step along where you've got something that's quite grounded. Maybe there are a couple of characters who are a little heightened, or it has moments that are heightened. Ted Lasso is one that comes to mind, where they're beautifully, a lot of the characters are beautifully real, but then sometimes they're a little bit out there, right? And they don't feel real, and then they do, right? So Ted Lasso is a really interesting one that kind of, it kind of migrates a little bit, and they have to navigate that, and they navigate that beautifully, right? Then you go a little further into the spectrum where it gets a little more heightened, like what I talked about before, maybe Schitt's Creek or 30 Rock, and then Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt's all at the other end where it's really out there, and as well things like maybe Star Trek or any of those kind of more, not over the top. Over the top's not a useful word, but a little more heightened, energetic, right? But what you need to understand, and this is the biggest problem and the biggest misconception, apart from, not everything's the same, the biggest problem with actors is that they think that it's supposed to be over the top, or that truthful's not a factor here. But it absolutely is. When you're doing this work, what you're doing is balancing that truthfulness, finding that the real part of the character in yourself, and finding the truthfulness in the situation, even when it's bizarre, right? That is our goal, and that is walking a really tricky tightrope. So doing this kind of stuff, doing heightened material, is a wonderful challenge for you about how to be believable, even when it's quite strange, even when the style is bigger, even when you're speaking archaic language, all of that stuff. It's a great challenge. How can I still be truthful? Now, it takes a while to learn how to do that, right? Most of us will fall on one side or the other, where we either are going for the really too grounded and we've lost the magic of some of that heightened stuff. Or maybe we go a little bit too far into the heightened and we lose the truthfulness. I've actually got another video on that, which is talking about how to manage that energy. So I highly recommend looking at that one next. I'll link it here and in the description, and I'll put it on screen at the end so you can go straight onto it. But for now, one of the most useful things that you can think about is firstly assessing, like, where does this fall on the spectrum? So if I'm doing an audition, for example, where does it fall on the spectrum? And if I'm doing Shakespeare, do I maybe need to bring a little more energy to it? And you can do that really simply by bringing more energy into your body. And I talk about that more in the next video, actually. So one of the most useful things you can do as an actor is to start to have that distancing, right, where you're watching things and with a critical eye and looking at where do they fall on the spectrum. So I would actually love if you could drop in the comments something that you're watching right now. It could be a movie, could be TV, and let me know where you think it falls on the spectrum, because this is really, really helpful for people that are watching this video and learning that assessment as well. It's subjective, right? So you might say, well, I think it's here because of X, and someone else might say, well, I think it's that, I think it's more here because of these elements. It shifts, and that's also what you're navigating, right? Is like with Ted Lasso, where you're not always going to be like, this show is 100% heightened or 100% naturalistic. You're not always going to have it that cut and dried. It might be, it's sometimes very naturalistic, sometimes it goes a bit heightened, or some characters are more heightened and the others are more grounded. So watching things with that critical eye will help a lot when you get your sides, maybe for a show that's new or that you haven't seen and you don't have long to figure it out. Learning to understand and see the signs of those different types of heightened things going on, those different categories of heightened popping up all over the place, that can really, really help you start to pitch your performance in different ways instead of being that one-trick pony that does everything the same way. But if you want to be cast more, and if you love those kinds of heightened shows and films, you need to learn how to do that. So that's part of what I teach. So you can subscribe and follow along with some of the videos here, or otherwise you can come to my Essentials Hub as a starting point. I teach Shakespeare, but what I'm really teaching is how to navigate exactly that. How do we handle when something's completely out there, and how do we make it more truthful? So if you want to learn more about that, just look in the description. I've got heaps of resources for you. You can join the Essentials Hub to start you off, or you can come and take classes with me in my studio. I've got so much stuff for you, but I'm going to link on screen the next video for you, which is going to talk about that, navigating that energy in a little bit more detail. So you can go straight onto that if you want to learn more about how to do this. But thank you for joining me, and I'll see you very, very soon. Bye.